Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Naomi Derner, and please make sure you stay muted. And if you have questions, put them in the chat. Thank you. Naomi?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sue, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for a second while I do that. I can share the presentation. Okay, can everybody see it? Great. Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Naomi Derner, and I've been a member of the Next Gen group for several years now, and I'm also a junior member of the Speakers Bureau of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. And I'm really glad to be sharing the story of my grandmother, Sara Popke, with you today. So first, let me start by telling you a little bit about me and my family. So I was born in 1972, and I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, living with my parents and my sister. After college, I moved to California, where I lived for many years, mostly in San Francisco, and that's where my children were born. And in 2007, we moved to Portland, Oregon, and we've lived here in Northeast Portland ever since. My kids are teenagers now and go to school in downtown Portland, and I'm an executive at a boutique business appraisal firm here in Portland. So growing up in New York City, I was very fortunate that both sets of my grandparents lived very nearby, and I spent a lot of time with them growing up. Now, for as long as I can remember, before I even knew what the Holocaust was, I knew that my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. I knew that made them different than other people's grandparents, even though I didn't really understand why they were different. I knew they spoke English with a very heavy accent, and they spoke Yiddish to my parents when they didn't want us grandkids to understand what they were saying. And they spoke Polish or Hungarian to each other when they didn't want the kids to know what they were saying. So I knew that we didn't have many relatives. We had a very small extended family, unlike a lot of my friends who had large clans full of great aunts and uncles and dozens of cousins. But I didn't understand why, and nobody ever talked about why. So here's an excerpt of my family tree so you can see how this all kind of comes together. So here in the middle is me, Naomi, and you got my parents, Irene and Barry, and my 4 grandparents. So all 4 of my grandparents, Solomon Berner, Irene Klein-Berner, Joseph Popke, and Sara Klein-Berner, all 4 of my grandparents were born in Europe in the 1910s and 1920s, and all 4 were Jewish. My father's parents were from Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and my mother's parents were from Poland. My mother was born in Poland, and my father was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany, where his parents met right after the war. Now, there were 9 million Jews in Europe before the Holocaust started, and so there are 9 million stories of the Holocaust. My 4 grandparents each have 4 very different experiences during the Holocaust. And growing up, my grandparents never talked about their experiences. I knew they were Holocaust survivors, but I didn't really know what that meant or what they went through. For some reason in my family, it was something we just didn't talk about. And the unfortunate part about that is I grew up not really knowing anything about their history and anything about their background. And I didn't feel like I could ask them about it. It wasn't until a few years ago that I learned more about what actually happened to them. Now, why don't people talk about their experiences? I'm not exactly sure, but there are a lot of reasons. For some, it was just too traumatic to bring up the topic and relive it again. Other people didn't want to burden their children with details of the horror they experienced. And I've heard of some survivors who didn't talk about it for decades, but began telling their stories when they were older, maybe in their 60s or 70s or 80s even. So today I'm going to talk about my maternal grandmother, Sara Klein Popke. Here's a picture of me and my grandmother, Sara, taken in 2002. Now, I'm going to tell her story because I know a lot more about her experience during the war than I do about my other 3 grandparents. And the reason I know more about her story is because she left a 6-hour audio tape where she talked about her life from her childhood in Poland in the 1920s, throughout her life, all the way in the United States into the 1990s, which is the time when this life story was recorded by my cousin's wife. The recording was made in the 1990s. And her story is much different from the story of my paternal grandparents, who were Hungarian and had a much different experience during the war. So today I'll tell you her story, and you'll get to hear some of her own words that she left on the tape about her experience during the Holocaust. Now, like I said, my grandparents never talked to their children or grandchildren about their Holocaust experiences when they were alive. But because of these tapes she left before she passed away, we can hear her talk about the Holocaust in her own words. And I feel kind of honored to be able to share my grandmother's story with you. And I do think she'd love the idea of people listening to her actual words. So we'll start now. Sara Klein, who is also called Sala Klein in Yiddish, was born in a small town in Warsaw, Poland in 1921. So she was the seventh of 10 children. Her father was a shoemaker, and her family were Orthodox Jews who were desperately poor. And they moved into the city of Warsaw when Sara was 6 years old. They lived in a cramped basement apartment in a neighborhood that many years later became the Warsaw Ghetto. In this basement apartment, Sara shared a bed with her sisters, and the whole family lived in only 2 rooms. Now, due to her extreme poverty, Sara didn't get to attend school after the 3rd grade. Instead, she started working when she was just 7 years old, cleaning and cooking for local families and taking care of their children as a nanny or a maid. On her tape, she talks about the family she worked for who would give her the dinner leftovers from their family to take home to her parents and her brothers and sisters, and kept them from going hungry at times. She always wanted to be educated, though. Even though she didn't go to school past 3rd grade, education was very important. On her tape, she talks about how jealous she was of a friend of hers who got to attend high school. Sara never actually did get to attend high school, but she did take some night classes that were put on by a charitable Jewish organization in Warsaw when she was a teenager. Now, Sara's family's poverty made her very resourceful. When she could, throughout a lot of her life, she took jobs working in kitchens or restaurants so she would have access to extra food. In 1937, when Sara was 16 years old, she took a job at a chocolate shop in Warsaw. And at this chocolate shop is where she met her future husband, my grandfather, Joe Papka. He was also 16, and they worked together at the shop.
Me and Joe used to go to the park after work and sit and talk, but we couldn't sit very long because the Polish students, they was very anti-Semitic. When they saw a Jewish girl or a Jewish boy, they started to hit by the heads.
So Sara mentioned this and many other incidences of anti-Semitic violence that she and her family endured during her teen years in Warsaw. Now, by 1939, when Sara was 17 years old, Adolf Hitler had already risen to power in Germany and had annexed Austria and invaded Czechoslovakia. Then in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, first with a massive bombing campaign, and then Nazi troops marched into Warsaw.
After 3 weeks, the Germans marched to Warsaw. I remember like now. We still went to work, me and Joe. We still went to work, to the shop, we still work. But when I saw the Germans they marched to Warsaw, I thought myself, oh, it's not going to be good here. Well, then the Polacks start to talk German, they start to show who is Jewish, who is not Jewish, and that's how it was. It was very bad. And then nobody could go to work. And we didn't have what to eat.
Now, for 3 months, Sara and her family lived in Warsaw under German occupation. Conditions became very dangerous for Jews like Sara and her family. The Nazi secret police, called the Gestapo, would randomly stop Jews in the street and assault them or kidnap them and send them to labor camps. One day, a Nazi soldier set fire to Sara's father's beard and burned his face very badly. In 1939, a law was passed in Poland that forced all Jews to wear a yellow star in their clothing or an armband identifying them as Jewish. Soon people couldn't go to work. Food was very scarce and hunger was starting to set in. A few weeks after Hitler invaded Poland, Joe told Sara that he wanted to run away from Warsaw and try to save himself. He wanted to run east, over the border to Russia. Joe had relatives in a city called Lutsk, which had been part of Poland. As a result of Hitler's invasion of Poland, Lutsk had been annexed by Russia and was now part of Russia and therefore free of Nazis. Joe wanted to go to Lutsk and escape the Nazis occupying Poland. So Joe asked Sara to run away with him to save their lives. But at age 18, Sara didn't feel like she could run away from home with a boy to whom she wasn't married and leave her parents. As Sara said on her tape, religious Jewish girls just didn't do that if they weren't married. So Joe left Warsaw to try to cross the border out of Nazi-occupied Poland and into Russia. Soon, other Jews started to run away to Russia too. First, Sara's sister Bronya ran to Russia with her husband and 2 children. Then her brother Morris ran away to Russia. By this point, the chocolate shop had closed. Sara found a job working at a restaurant, one frequented, unfortunately, by Nazi soldiers. She worked in the restaurant and she was able to steal enough food from her workplace to keep herself and her family from starving. Now, not long after Joe left, in October 1939, a young Polish man appeared at Sara's house with a note from Joe. The Polish man appeared with a note saying that Joe had made it across the Polish border to Russia, to his aunt's house in Lutsk. He said there were no Nazis in Lutsk and he found work and lived free.
After about a week, one young Polak came over to my parents' house and he gave me a little paper. The paper was written that Joe, that he begged me to come to Woods to cross the border, the German, the Russian border, and to come to Russia. Well, I couldn't decide what to do. Then my father said, Sally, you are young, go to Russia and save your life.
So now the situation for Jews in Warsaw was worsening by the day. There were rumors in Warsaw that Jews who were arrested by Nazis on the street every day were being sent to secret death centers and not to labor camps like they were told. After speaking with her parents, Sara decided to run away from Warsaw, cross the border into Russia, and try to meet up with Joe in Lutsk. She tried to convince her parents to come with her, but they felt that they were too old and their health wasn't strong enough to make the trip. It was late October, and Sara had only a light coat, a pair of shoes, a purse, a watch, and enough money for a single loaf of bread when she left her home. Now, Warsaw is about 250 miles from Lutsk. To get there, Sara had to take the train from Warsaw to Malkin, which was 75 miles away on the Russian border, and then cross the border at Malkin and go to Bialystok. It was a harrowing train ride.
That's how I went from Warsaw to Malkin by the border. But it wasn't easy. I had to go by the train. In the train, it was all Gestapo. They look every eyes in the people. Not this that I was afraid. I really was afraid, but in my eyes saw, and I saw that every 5 minutes a Jewish girl or a boy flew out from the window in the trains. But I did sit and look down, and I thought, what is going to be is going to be.
When Sara got to the border town of Malkine, she encountered thousands of other people, Jewish men, women, and children, all at the border, also helping to cross out of Nazi-occupied Poland and into Russia. Although there were no Nazis at the border in Malkine when Sara arrived, Russian soldiers at the border were not allowing Jews to cross into Russia. Some people who had money or valuables would bribe the Russian soldiers to let them cross. But Sara had no money or valuables and couldn't do that. She sat at the border with the crowds for 2 days and 2 nights. It was cold and it had started to snow, even though it was still October. She had no food and grew very hungry. On the second night, Sara felt like she was becoming sick, like she had a fever. She went to a house near the border, knocked on the door, and told the lady who answered the door that she was cold, hungry, and sick. Sara was really lucky that night. Even though Sara had no money to give, the lady felt sorry for her, gave her straw, and let her sleep on the floor inside where it was warm. Later that night, around 3 or 4 a.m., Sara heard shouting from outside where the crowds were gathered at the border. She could hear that the Nazis had made it to Malkine and they were attacking the Jews at the border. She heard a lot of shouting and commotion, and then terrifying gunshots coming from where the Jewish refugees had been waiting to cross. Although Sara was warm in the lady's house, she was terrified and couldn't sleep at all that night. And late that night, Nazis knocked on the lady's door to see if there were any Jews hiding in the house.
One assessment he hit me with his rifle and he asked the Polish lady, "Is this a Jewish girl?" And she said, "No." Nine. My heart was so beating that I thought, that's it. I am dead. And in the morning, I went out to the border, outside, and wait. And I told the lady, Polish lady, that I thank you very much for saving my life.
Now let's remember that this was a time when harboring Jews can be punishable by death. Yet this Polish lady lied to the SS man and saved my grandmother's life. This story is an example of one of the rare times during the Holocaust that an ordinary Polish citizen risked their own life to hide, protect, and save a Jew. When Sara got outside, the crowds of people were mostly all gone. She heard from another Jewish girl she had befriended at the border that the Nazis had confiscated all the food, money, and valuables from the Jews waiting to cross into Russia and had shot and killed many as well. Well, Sara got lucky this time, and a Russian soldier took pity on her and her friend, and they let Sara and her friend cross the border after dark that night. She and her friend walked all night, about 10 or 15 miles into Russia, until she found someone to take them to Bialystok, a small city about 75 miles away. So she made it to Bialystok, but Sara didn't have any money for food or anywhere to sleep. So she slept where she could. She slept in a synagogue or in a church, in a park on a bench, or in an alleyway. She got bits of work when she could find it, but work was scarce. Sara didn't have anything to eat for the first 4 days she was in Bialystok, until some Russian soldiers took pity on her and bought her a meal. Life in Bialystok was very hard for sure, but from Sara's perspective, at least there were no Nazis there. After 2 weeks, Sara left Bialystok to look for Joe in Lutsk, which was about 200 miles away from where she was. So Sara made it to Lutsk. She was able to find Joe. And she said that Lutsk was very nice compared to Warsaw. She said they lived in an apartment with Joe's 2 aunts and some cousins, and her and Joe got jobs working in a bakery. Now, Sara then talked about how Joe's aunts insisted that she and Joe get married. They said that they can't live there unmarried and that it's wartime, and the 2 of them really needed each other. They were essentially orphans, and that being married was going to be in their best interest. So Joe and Sara on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1939, they got married in a wedding ceremony attended only by Joe's aunts and the rabbi who married them. After the ceremony, Sara recalls that they trudged through waist-high snow to go back to Joe's aunt's apartment, and then they ate some soup and bread. That was it. That was their wedding. Joe and Sara were 18 years old. So a few months after that, Sara and Joe's luck started to run out again. Joe's aunts were evicted from their apartment by their anti-Semitic landlord. The aunts went to live with their adult children, but Joe and Sara didn't have anywhere to live. There were so many refugees from Poland and Russia at the time. Sara and Joe had no money and nowhere to sleep. So again, they were homeless, and they slept where they could, in a synagogue, in a church. As spring 1940 approached and the weather warmed up, they would sleep in the park. They worked when they could find work, and they were very often hungry. Life was very hard indeed. In May 1940, Joe and Sara heard that the Russian government was registering all Polish Jewish refugees and giving the refugees a choice: go deep into Russia and take jobs working for the Russian government, or return to their homes in Poland. Joe and Sara were living on the street, had no money and no food, nowhere to sleep. They didn't want to go back to Poland, which was still under Nazi occupation. So they registered with the Russian government and were put on a wagon caravan to deep Russia, which is, I think, the region around Siberia. Now, this was not a nice Amtrak train with sleeping cars. It was cattle wagons with straw on the floor where the people sat and slept. But despite the Spartan conditions, Joe and Sara were thankful to have a roof over their heads, even if it was in a cattle wagon, and for the 3 meals a day provided by the Russian government, which they felt was better than being hungry and sleeping on the street. It was still 6 long weeks of traveling in those cattle wagons, sleeping in straw, until they reached Siberia, which is way, way deep in Russia, very far from Poland. And Siberia is where Sara ended up spending the rest of the war. So just a little perspective for people who might not be familiar. I often give this I talk to students, they're not always familiar with the geography, but this idea gives you an idea. The yellow here in the middle here is Poland, with Warsaw in the middle of it. And basically the red dot here is Tumen, which is deep in Russia, in Siberia, and it's about 2,000 miles from Warsaw. So kind of the distance from Portland to Atlanta, Georgia. So they were very, very far from home at this point, especially compared to where they were when they were in Lutsk, which was only 250 miles from Bialystok. I'm sorry, from Lutsk was just 250 miles from Bialystok and not that far from, not much further from Warsaw. So they took this trip. It was 6 weeks long in the cattle wagons. And when they got to Siberia, they were taken to a small work camp in the forest where Joe, Sara, and a few hundred other Jewish refugees worked cutting down trees in teams of 3. Life wasn't easy. Sara and Joe lived in an unheated barracks with no running water and shared an iron bed. But Sara talks about how they were given a small night table, but they didn't have any possessions to put in the night table. The only thing they had when they arrived at the forest camp was literally the clothes on their backs. But they were working and they were earning a small amount of money and they had food to eat. And most importantly, they weren't in prisons and they weren't under Nazi control, so they felt free. In late 1940, Sara began to feel extra tired, and soon she realized she was pregnant. In her interview, Sara talks about how very, very lucky she felt that the foreman in the forest camp where she worked sent her to a hospital in a nearby city to deliver her baby when it was time. The foreman took her on a 2-hour ride in a horse and wagon to the hospital. And she went to the warm hospital where she was served 3 meals a day. And there was a Russian doctor to tend to her when she gave birth. She told the story in great detail because she wanted to impress about how rare something was at the time and how lucky she felt to be in a hospital with a doctor during wartime, especially as a refugee. In March 1941, Sara gave birth to her first son, Bolek. Sara was so happy to give birth to a son. And when she stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks, which apparently was normal at the time, according to Sara, but when she was ready to leave the hospital, Sara didn't have anything for her baby. She didn't have any diapers. She didn't have clothes. She didn't have blankets, nothing. Sara was going to have to bring her baby back to the barracks in the forest camp naked. But the Russian nurses in the hospital were very kind to this young refugee mother. The nurses brought her diapers, a blanket, some old baby clothes for Boleks to wear. Basically, they brought her some rags. So Sara brought newborn Bolek back to the barracks in the forest camp dressed in the rags collected by hospital nurses. And at this time, it was 1941, and Sara had just turned 20 years old. So I just want to stop for a second and tell you about my uncle Bolek, who is still alive today. He turned 80 years old just a few weeks ago. And Bolek, who you just heard was born during wartime and almost had to leave the hospital naked, he is a true rags to riches story. So he, after the war, well, you'll hear about what happens during the war, but in his life, what he ended up doing is he grew up to be a very successful businessman. He's been married now for almost 60 years. He has 3 children. He has many grandchildren, several of whom are graduating high school and college this month. And he ran a very successful business in New Jersey for many years. So now he's 80 and he still leads a very active life. And again, has been very financially successful. Definitely a true rags to riches story. So after Bullock was born, Sara and Bullock went back to the forest work camp and life continued on. By August 1941, things had changed. Russia was now at war with Germany. The economic situation in Russia was growing very dire. There wasn't much food and people were starting to go hungry, even starved to death in large numbers. And it wasn't just the Jewish refugees, but the Russian people were starving too. Sara and Joe decided to make some changes. First, they decided to leave the forest camp and go to a nearby city. Now, Sara doesn't explain why they were able to move from the forest camp to the city, just that they did. Although my understanding from what Sara says on the tape was that the refugees were registered with the Russian government, and therefore they were always required to be working at a job. They were not permitted to be unemployed. And so it sounded as if they did have some choices for employment. So Sara and Joe moved to a nearby city, and Sara got a job in the kitchen of a factory. Even though Sara was getting paid to work, times were difficult, and there just wasn't enough food to buy at stores, and she couldn't afford prices for food on the black market. So working in a kitchen again allowed Sara to steal enough food to keep them alive. Now, another thing that happened right around then was that shortly after moving to the city, Joe decided that he wanted to fight in the war effort for Poland. So in 1941, 20-year-old Joe left his wife Sara and his newborn baby Bullock in Siberia and returned to Poland to fight the Nazis. Now, I wish I could tell you where he went, how Joe got there, where he fought, who he fought with, and what happened to him. But unfortunately, I don't know any of that. On her tape, Sara mentions that Joe left to fight for Poland, as she says, but she gave no further details. And I've done a lot of research and I still have not figured out the answers to these questions. I think I'll have to actually go to Poland at some point to research this because the internet has not turned up any answers. So Joe left Russia in late 1941 to go fight for Poland, and we don't hear about him again on Sara's tape until after the war in 1947. So from 1941 until the war ended in 1945, Sara and Bullock survived by living as refugees in Siberia, with Sara working in kitchens. Although she did feel lucky to be free from Nazi control in Siberia, times were very, very hard. There was very little food. People were starving all around them. And although my grandmother was very grateful to have her life saved by the Russians, she mentions many times on tape about the hunger they experienced while in Russia. All of her earnings were not enough to buy enough food to keep her and Bullock alive. So Sara survived by stealing food from her workplace. And at times in the winter, she would have to leave Bullock in an orphanage during the week while she worked so that he would get enough food and warmth, as she didn't have enough food for him and her quarters were too cold to keep the baby warm. All this time, Sara heard that things were very bad for the Jews in Poland and around Europe, but she really didn't know to what extent. She didn't know if her parents, her siblings, and friends in Warsaw were still alive or not. She didn't know where Joe was, and she didn't know what happened to him after she left Russia. So the war ended in 1945, and in 1946, Sara and Bullock left Russia with many other Jewish refugees and returned to Poland. Sara talked about how her supervisor at the factory warned her not to go back to Poland. He said that her family was likely all dead, and she would just go back to more anti-Semitism. Sara found it hard to believe that her family might all be dead, all of her brothers and sisters. So she and Bullock, along with tens of thousands of other Jewish refugees, again boarded cattle wagons with floors lined with straw and spent weeks traveling back to Poland. Sara tells a story at one point in her tapes about how the train she was on, which was filled with thousands of Jewish refugees, pulled into a station in Poland, and the crowds of locals came out, yelling and throwing bottles at the train, screaming, "No Jews! Hitler didn't finish the job, but we will," and other anti-Semitic things. This scared Sara very much. She began to wonder if her factory supervisor was right, and she worried how life would be once they got back to Warsaw. When Sara and Bullock arrived back in Warsaw, she was saddened to see that everything was gone. The apartment in which her family had lived was located in an area that became the Warsaw Ghetto. This area and much of Warsaw was reduced to rubble during the war. And shortly after arriving in Warsaw, Sara ran into an old childhood friend of her sister Manya named Yannick. Yannick had been in love with Sarah's sister Manya when they were in high school, but Yannick was not Jewish and Sarah's parents forbid Manya from dating Yannick, but they had remained friends. So when Sara saw Yannick that day, her and Yannick sat down and Yannick told Sara what he knew about what happened to the rest of her family during the war. He said that a few months after Sara left for Russia, the Nazis forced all the Jews to live in very cramped, dirty, dangerous conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto. The ghetto was walled in and locked, and Jews couldn't leave without permission under penalty of death. Yannick told Sara that he visited her sister Manya and the rest of the family in the ghetto, and he would bring them any food he could spare from 1940 through the end of 1942. Even so, Yannick said that it wasn't enough, and over the months and years, Sara's sister Manya and Sara's parents and siblings grew sicker and sicker from the hunger and harsh conditions. He said that by late 1942, Manya had grown so emaciated that she couldn't even walk, and Sara's father had already died of starvation by then. Then Yannick talked about the deportations. Yannick said that when he heard that the Nazis were deporting Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to killing centers around Poland, he didn't believe it could be true. But Yannick told Sara that one day shortly after New Year's 1943, he came to the ghetto to bring Sara's family some food, but when he got there, everyone was gone. Nobody was in the apartment and the apartment was a mess. It looked like the Gestapo had been through the apartment and trashed it. He never saw Manya or Sara's mother or siblings again. Yannick believes they were deported to Auschwitz or maybe another killing center and murdered. So it wasn't until 1947 that Joe found Sara again. Again, Sara doesn't say in her audio tape where Joe had been or what happened to him when he was gone. And I've talked to my mother and my uncles and they don't know where he was. All she said was that Joe was fighting for Poland and that she received a letter from him in 1946 and he returned home at the beginning of 1947. Now, in the end, all of Joe's family had been murdered by the Nazis in what we now call the Holocaust. Joe's parents, all three of his siblings, his aunts and cousins in Lutsk, not one of them survived. Joe didn't have a single living relative after the war aside from his wife, Sara, and his son, Bolek. I've been doing genealogy research for years now, and I still haven't been, including DNA research on 23andMe and lots of different places, and I still haven't found a single relative or descendant of my grandfather, Joe, that may have survived. As for Sara, both of her parents died of starvation. Of her 9 siblings, only 2 of her brothers, Shaul and Morris, and 2 of her sisters, Bronya and Genius, survived the war. After the war, Shaul and Morris both ended up in the United States. They married, had families, and lived in the New York, New Jersey area for the rest of their lives. And Bronya and Genia both immigrated to Israel where they raised their families. After the war, Sara and Joe settled into family life in Poland. My uncle Henry was born in 1949 and my mother Irene was born in 1951. But Sara wasn't very happy in Poland. There was quite a bit of anti-Semitism towards Jews in post-war Poland. And as communism in Poland grew, it seemed to Sara that the anti-Semitism worsened. So in 1956, like many Holocaust survivors, Sara and her family emigrated from Poland to Israel under Israel's right of return. Both of Sara's sisters already lived in Israel, and Sara wanted her family to live free from anti-Semitism. The picture you're seeing on the screen is the picture that my grandmother used on her registration to immigrate to Israel in 1956. My uncle Henry was 7 years old, and my mother Irene was 5 years old. So they moved to Israel, and they were there for a few years. But Sara did not feel that the family had enough opportunity in Israel. And a few years later, they moved to the United States. Sara's brother Morris, who had also survived the war by running away to Russia, had moved to New Jersey after the war. Morris was able to sponsor Sara, Joe, my mom, and my uncle for immigration to the United States. In 1960, Sara and her family, including my mother Irene, who was 9 years old at the time, again moved, this time to the United States. And in 1966, Sara became a US citizen. Here you're looking at a picture now of her naturalization certificate. So Sara and Joe raised their children in New York City, first living in the Bronx and then in Brooklyn, where I was born later on. Joe worked for an elevator manufacturer and Sara cleaned office buildings at night and later worked as a seamstress. Eventually, Joe and Sara's children, including my mother, grew up and married. And in the 1980s, Joe and Sara retired to Miami, Florida. Joe passed away in 1995. Actually, he passed away right before my grandmother, right before my grandmother made the tapes. She made the tapes about a year after he died. And then Sara moved back to New York to be closer to her children and grandchildren. So here's a picture of Sara, who's in the purple, who's taken in 2005 with 3 generations. On the far right and the far left is my sister and me. In the white shirt, sitting on the couch, is my mother, Irene. And the baby on my mom's lap is Sara's great-granddaughter, Veronica, my daughter, my oldest child. So we've got 3 generations. It's a pretty special picture. And here's another picture in 2007. It's Sara with my son Gabriel, who's now 14. But this is her youngest great-grandchild, and this is my mother Irene with her. So Sara was 92 years old when she died in 2013. She had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 13 great-grandchildren. Sara was always a dedicated mother and grandmother. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were her greatest loves. Sara never learned to drive, but even well into her 80s, she can get anywhere by bus in New York City or Miami Beach. She loved to play bingo, she loved to read romance novels, and she had a beautiful singing voice. She made the best chicken soup, as kreplach, and potato latkes. Sara was so very, very proud of her descendants. It meant so much to her that her grandchildren were educated and that almost all have college and graduate degrees, something she had the opportunity to do during her childhood after quitting school to work when she was 7. She was over the moon that 2 of her children, my cousins, and 2 spouses of grandchildren are doctors, made her so proud. So that's all I have today about my grandmother. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share her story, and I'd be glad to take any questions if people have them.
Thank you, Naomi. That was quite a story. Quite a lot of detail, and the slides, I think, really helped. We do have one question that was in the chat. It was about Joe. How could Joe fight for Poland when Poland had been taken over by the Nazis? Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. You know, it's kind of a question that I've had for a while. I don't have a full answer to that question because the Polish government, Poland didn't have an army at the time. It was taken over by Nazis. There were a couple of, my understanding is that in Russia, there was some regiments comprised partly of Polish refugees, including Jewish refugees who fought. Now, I can't really verify that because I haven't found any records. I've been told that the best shot of finding military records is to actually go to Poland, but that's the best lead I have at this point, because you're right, there was no army in Poland, and the Nazis had taken over. So I think it was Poles who were fighting as part of under Russian command, is what I believe it was. Although I've asked my uncles about this, including my uncle Bolek, who remembers spent more time in Poland as a child with my grandfather, and he insists that my grandfather had Polish medals at some point, that he did fight indeed for Poland. And my grandmother at one point tells a story about how she was able to get a better apartment in Poland after the war because her husband fought for Poland. So that's still a mystery I'm trying to uncover the answer to.
I'm looking at the chat. It could have been, somebody said it could have been an underground army that he was in, and he probably fought in the underground army, which was very active during German occupation.
Yeah, there's some. Yeah, I thought maybe he could be a partisan. There was something called Anders' army that ended up being sent out to the desert, which I'm pretty sure he wasn't part of. There really weren't that many ways that Polish Jews could fight openly. So, yeah, underground army might have been it. I'm always, if anybody has any detailed leads on places to look, I'd love it, because it's just not a lot of information about this.
Somebody wanted to know, how did you get to Portland? Oh
yeah, so I grew up in New York City, and in fact, pretty much all my family lives still in the New York, New Jersey area. After I went to college in Pittsburgh, and then after college, I went to grad school in Santa Barbara, California. And I lived in California then for about 13 years, mostly in San Francisco. And then I had a job working in investment banking, which required a lot of travel. But then after my two children were born, when they were babies, it seemed like raising children in San Francisco, working at a job that required a lot of travel wasn't as interesting anymore. And so myself and their dad decided to move to Portland because we thought it'd be a nice place to raise kids. And it certainly has. It's been a great place to raise children. My kids are 14 and 16 now. And they've been here since they were babies. It's been great.
So I think what I might do now is just go ahead and if you have something, a comment, or you have a question for Naomi, you don't have to put it in the chat. You can just you can just unmute yourself and make a comment or.
Hey, Naomi, this is Estelle. Hi. What such a really beautiful job. Really impressive. But so there's a lot of people I think in this group that are considering becoming speakers or present or creating a story. And so I would ask, what did you learn from this process? Well, I guess two questions. What did you learn in researching this story about Sara that you didn't know? And then what kind of advice or guidance could you give other people that are thinking about getting started?
It's funny, Estelle, that question is kind of, what happened here? That question is kind of funny because the first presentation that I gave to Next Gen Group that Sue had mentioned was a presentation about that, like about my process, but it was when I was researching my other grandparents whose story was a lot more of a mystery to me because they didn't leave an audio, they didn't leave a tape, they said nothing, and I had to do everything through internet and International Tracing Service and Arrelson Archive research. And so on this one, what did I learn? I mean, I definitely got a better understanding, I'd say, of I'd heard that I knew all along that my grandmother had been in Russia for the war, but I knew not a single detail of what that meant, how they got there. I didn't know any of that. All I knew was very, big outlines. And so, so I learned a lot, including what I just talked about before, how there really was no Polish army, and it was different, what was going on there. So I learned a lot. In terms of what advice I would have for people doing research, I mean, I've got a lot of advice. In fact, I have a whole other presentation on that advice, but I'd say, the internet is your friend, and joining groups like NextGen where you can learn things, where you get to absorb bits of information that help you in your own research is good. Joining groups on Facebook dedicated to genealogy. And, and there's various other online resources, but nowadays there's so many great online resources. And if people have, if people are looking to do research, everybody, especially at 3G, are totally welcome to, people are totally welcome to contact me for advice. Cause I have spent like now the last, 6, 7, 8 years doing this. And it's been, it's been quite a process. I don't think of my research will ever be done. I think I'll be researching, because, I'll never really know all the answers.
So Naomi, I mean, I know my family's from Holland, so I know that the International Red Cross, I mean, I know they have an office in The Hague, but they probably have offices in other places too. And a lot of records that the Germans kept are housed there. So you can get access to those records.
Yeah, so Arrelson, like the International Tracing Service, which now is called Arrelson Archives, is probably the best. I think it's the best repository of, of all the data that the Nazis collected. That's, I mean, there's millions and millions and millions of items of data that they got from the camp.
Can you put into chat the name or send that to us?
Absolutely, I'll put it in the chat right now. It's called Arrelson Archives. And if you just Google that, it'll bring you right to the right site where it's probably the best place to search for original documents. Registration cards at camps, records of deportation, lists. I mean, just everything. They've scanned them in, millions and millions and millions of documents, and they're scanning in new documents all the time. So there was a period I did my research, and I don't want to say I got to the end of the internet, but a little bit I did get to the end of the internet in terms of resources. But then over the last, I want to say 3 years, they've put almost everything on the internet for, in this Errolson archives. And they're putting, they're constantly digitizing and putting new stuff on every day. So every few months, there'll be like a big data dump and there'll be new information. So I actually have to check this more often now. And also, I just want to say, while I'm talking about Errolson Archives, for anybody who's looking for great at-home volunteer opportunities, Errolson Archives, if you go on there, you'll see they're asking for volunteers, where what you do is you just sit at home and you enter data. They'll put up like a registration card and they'll tell you what they have all sorts of guides in there. They make it super easy where you're just verifying data to enter into their database so other people searching could find information about the relatives. So if anybody is interested in actually increasing the amount of information online from that era, and wants to volunteer, Errolson Archives is a great place. Anybody with a computer can do it from home, even 5 minutes at a time. It's called Errolson Archives. I have it, yeah, AROLSEN. I have it in the chat. Just Google that, and afterwards I'll have Sue. We'll after this in the next few days we'll email around. I'll email around the link. Richard, did you have something?
Richard has something. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation, and I would like to apply for presidency of your fan club.
Thank you, Richard.
2 points. It was a very sad sequel to the liberation after many survivors returned to Poland following Death March, all of it harrowing. So many of the Polish people were cruel and abusive to the returnees. Second point is, wow, Sara certainly survived with a combination of true grit and being able to think on her feet. And it's a remarkable story and testament to the fact that we can do it. Strong people can survive even the toughest situations. Thank you again. Wonderful.
Thank you, Richard.
I just wanted to say it has something to do with, finding people. I am going to dinner tomorrow night with some second and third cousins of mine that I didn't know existed, who found me on ancestry.com. My grandmother maiden name was Schick, and they are Schicks. And they're coming up. Their youngest son graduated from law school today, and so they're in town, and we're going to meet at Ricardo's tomorrow night for dinner. And the sister of the gal, I'm related to the guy, sister of the gal lives in Vancouver, Washington. So all of a sudden I have this new family I never even knew I had. So it's kind of exciting. So I just thought I'd tell everybody.
That's great.
Great.
Good for
So
you.
nice.
Thank you,
That's
Naomi,
wonderful.
that you did such a wonderful job. And it's so wonderful that you have, the recording. I just so wish I had my mother talking, I just think that just adds so much. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing her voice, I mean, she passed away 8 years ago, but I spent a lot of time growing up with her, and she's got that wonderful, rich accent. And, it's just, I do love using the voice. I'm going to turn this, I have a short presentation now because we're doing it for Zoom, but when we're in the schools, they ask for a longer presentation. And so I've got, hours worth. So there's definitely, I'm going to put a few more in there. And, it's, it really, I think, does bring it to life a little bit to hear from her directly.
So Naomi, it's also really good that you put the script on there, because I think for a lot of people, she's hard to understand. So that's really smart that you do that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It is hard. I mean, I understand her perfectly because I grew up hearing her accent.
Sure.
People who are much less familiar,
Sure.
it's difficult to understand.
Well, it's great.
Naomi, there was a part where I maybe didn't quite understand, but I was wondering how Joe found her in Warsaw. What?
Okay, you are on.
I am unmuted.
Yeah, go ahead, Clarice.
Okay. Maybe I missed something in the story, but how did Joe find Naomi once she went back to Poland? Was it just sort of?
Yeah, I'm not exactly, she doesn't exactly say, although she does talk in her audio about how after the war, when she went back to Warsaw, there was a significant effort to reunite people with family, and that she actually, she was somewhere looking at lists of, she didn't say what the lists were, but she said that she was looking at lists of survivors when she first got to Warsaw, and she ran into her sister online who was also looking for lists.
Yeah, there was in the United States, there was a newspaper that was called Aufbau. And I remember my parents getting that all the time, looking for their relatives. You know, there were names in it all the time from, starting in, end of 44, 45, 46, 47. Everybody would write in, looking for Max Feelgood, and then somebody would write in if they found them and so on. And that went on for years and years, And so there were all sorts of things like that were going on, where people were, my mother, to find her brother, I mean, unfortunately he was dead, but to find out what had happened to her brother, she somehow or other heard the name of somebody who lived in Salzburg that knew Max, and he wrote her a letter and told her what had happened, so there was just this whole network going on between people, finding people, somebody would know somebody and they know somebody else, and maybe they knew about somebody. So it's really, you don't know exactly how, but there was a lot of that going on.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, I think Leslie and Ava, did you have a question? Did you want to say something?
Yes. First of all, I want to thank you, Naomi, so much. This was such a wonderful presentation. And as survivors, both Les and I have been talking here, and we just want to tell you that it gives us so much hope, because we know the second generation been involved for quite a while, but such a heartwarming feeling to know that this history of survivors are being carried on now by the third generation. And as we already have great-grandchildren, we have everything sort of in different places written down what happened to us, because we are hoping this is continue forever. Because if we don't continue these histories, time will come that they're really going to say it's never happened. So thank you for that. And the other thing I wanted to mention to you, in Hungary, after the war, they had by the Jewish synagogues and in different places of worship and by the old ghetto, they had different sort of big boards put up with names where people were looking for family members. And surprisingly enough, and through the Red Cross, that's how some people connected. We didn't have internet.
Oh, Naomi?
Yeah, hey Gary, thanks Eva.
Just a question, I may have lost something in it. When Sara was traveling by train with the Gestapo, which just must have been heart-wrenching, to say the least, that she survived that. When she arrived at the border, how long did it take her to get from the border to Joe? Is it Lutska? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Lutsk, yeah, Lutsk, which I think now is in the Ukraine, maybe?
Okay. How long did it take her to get to Lutsk, and how did she find him? Was it small enough that it was like a word of mouth, or?
My understanding was that she so she took the train to Malkin, which was I think about 75 miles, no, about 200 miles away from Warsaw. And then when she got there, so it was only, it was not a long trip. When she got there, she spent a night walking into Malkin. And then she doesn't say how, she just said, we got a ride to Białystok. So she doesn't say how, but Bialystok, I think, was about 75 miles away from there. And then again, she did not detail how she got to Lutsk, but it was about 200 and something miles. And then in Lutsk, the reason she was able to find Joe is because the person who brought her the piece of paper with the note, the address was on there. And so she
I see.
had an address to go to. She had a specific location to go to.
I see. Interesting. Well, and just the constant threats, she must have been, her life might have been, threatened when she was, walking, through these roads, and it just must have been terrifying. Just very brave, very incredible story. Just both your grandparents just must be just amazing. And just the drive of the Jewish community going back and immigrating. You hear the stories about the success of your uncle. You always hear about somebody that came over with like $8 and they managed to, turn turn everything around for themselves.
So Gary, if you excuse me just for a second,
I'm sorry.
wrap things up formally, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go ahead and keep the meeting open. I have to leave. I have another event starting at 5 that I have to be at. But so I just want to thank Naomi. It's just hearing a 3G. I mean, it's just amazing. And as you know, some of you are speakers, it's takes a lot of energy to do this and to go back and talk about these things that aren't necessarily easy to talk about. So we so appreciate anyone who's speaking, and Naomi it was amazing. There was a lot of nice compliments in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, but it's always hard to say goodbye in these kinds of get-togethers, but I'll go ahead and to leave it open if people want to continue to chat. And oh, good, Naomi, you put your email in there too. Okay.
Yeah, people can email me if they want, if they want follow up on the Errolson archive.